Join me on an unusual journey, but beware, for what awaits us is the wildest menagerie of magic, mystery, and monsters. Blackwater Media presents Darkfall Anthology 6. I was living in a house in Laguna Beach that had been there since the 1920s. In its history, it had been a speakeasy, a brothel, and a house for smuggling illegal immigrants. One day, my wife and I decided to do a little barbecuing. She decided to run out to one of the local markets and pick up some steaks and burgers. When she left, I stretched out to do some reading. From my bedroom, I could look across the hall into the bathroom, then through the bathroom and down the other hall. From this vantage point, I just noticed movement out of the corner of my eye and looked down there. Now listen, I'm going to tell you what I saw. There was, honest to God, and this gives me goosebumps typing about it all these years later. There was a black figure, maybe 3.5, 4 feet tall, and it was only vaguely humanoid. It looked like black scribbles, like someone had scribbled a human shape, but the scribbles moved like electricity surging. That's the best way to describe it. There was no sound that I could remember. I distinctly remember when I saw it. For whatever reason, I wasn't afraid, just like, what the fuck? Then it noticed me looking at it. I can't say it turned around. I just felt that it was focusing on me. Then I got scared. I didn't move. I didn't scream, nothing. I just stood there frozen because it just fucking came right at me. It rushed down the hall towards me. Now, I have no idea what its intent was, but it couldn't have been good, right? Well, as soon as it entered the bathroom, the door closest to me just slammed shut on it. Then, I'm embarrassed to say, I screamed and I yelled for my wife, and she wasn't home. I ran outside into the sunlight and didn't go back in until she got home about 30 minutes later. I told my wife about it and asked her if she'd had any similar experiences like that in the house. She said that she hadn't. Anyway, we grilled our steaks and burgers and we both enjoyed some bourbon on the rocks. We had conversations about a million different things and even broke into laughter from time to time. It actually turned out to be a great evening. We never had anything like that happen again. And I'm damn glad. It was the fall of 1978, deer season in particular. I lived near a very small town in Suchez, Georgia. At the time, it had a population of around 1,000 people. It's in the southeast end of the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'm an avid hunter and I was hunting on public land in the National Forest just up the road from Suchez in an area called Cooper's Creek. I'd scouted out the area during the summer, so late July, early August, I knew where all the game trails were, and I knew where water was located, which happens to be a small creek known as Bryant Creek. And I knew where all of the ridges and gaps were. I've hunted in and around this area for years and was very familiar with the area. Well, when I finally located a good spot, or at least a spot I thought would give me a good chance of a large buck, I set up my lock-on tree stand in a tree about 12 feet off the ground. I trimmed the branches to give me some shooting lanes and basically was all set for deer season. Oh, I was hunting with a 12 gauge shotgun. Rifle hunting was not allowed in the area. So let's fast forward to early November. I've been hunting out of my tree stand about 6 times by the time this particular hunt happened. It was late afternoon around 4:15. I wanted to get there earlier, but work held me up. We'd hired this new kid named Ryan, and that little son of a bitch had been slowing me down all week. Anyway, this was a Friday. I finished up at work, jumped in my truck, and headed out to my hunting spot. Now, this was my normal routine for a Friday afternoon during deer season, and my wife knew that I would not be home until around 8:30 that night, or even later if I bagged something. I parked my truck at the trailhead and started hiking into the woods to find my tree stand. The walk takes about 15 to 20 minutes. You want to walk pretty quickly, but not run. You don't want to make too much noise moving through the woods. You don't want to spook any of the wildlife. As I was walking to my stand, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, it was very quiet. I didn't hear any of the normal chirping or singing birds, no insects, nothing, and only a slight breeze. I thought it was a bit strange, but continued on to my deer stand. I finally arrived, climbed up, and settled in. Now, once I was comfortable, I jacked around into the chamber, put the safety on my shotgun, and began surveying the surroundings. I was looking for anything that seemed out of place. Sometimes deer bed down during the day, and you can spot their antlers above the tall grass and underbrush. As I was doing this, I began to have this ominous feeling that someone was watching me. I don't really know how to explain it other than I had this deep feeling, deep within me, in my core, in my gut. Something wasn't right. Well, I tried to ignore it for a while, telling myself to stop being such a coward. There's nothing out here but you, some deer hopefully, some squirrels, skunks, and, other little critters. As time passed, the feeling only intensified. I kept looking at my watch, wondering how much time I had left until dusk. Should I leave early? I thought to myself. Of course not. A huge deer was probably only moments away. As I was sitting there arguing with myself, I caught movement to my right side in the trees. I slowly turned my head and began looking through the tree canopy, and that's when I saw it. This is the part that still gives me the chills, even saying it now all these years later. I honestly don't know what this thing was. As I was staring into the trees, I saw what looked like a large bodybuilder, but completely blurry, moving through the trees. I could clearly see the outline of a figure, but the rest was blurry. I couldn't focus on it. It looked like a clear, gelatinous blob, but in the shape of a human, and I mean a large human. And whenever it would stop, I completely lost sight of it. It blended into the background perfectly. I just watched it for what seemed like an eternity, but in actuality it was more like 15 minutes. Its movement through the trees was effortless, like a monkey or a squirrel. It never really looked at me while I was watching, but maybe it had been before, and that's why I got the feeling someone was watching me, but I don't know. That slowly moved off, and I was scared about my walk back to my truck. So I waited for another 30 minutes. It was getting dark, and I slowly climbed out of my stand. Once I hit solid ground, I wasted no time. I sprinted all the way back to my truck. I jumped into the cab of my rusty Ford pickup truck, and my lungs were on fire. That was the farthest and fastest I'd run since basic training back in '67. I just sat there in my truck and tried to regain my breath. I drove home and said nothing to my wife or anyone else for a few weeks. As time passed, I tried to convince myself that I imagined it all, that I dozed off in the tree stand and had some sort of weird dream. But I couldn't get the idea of that thing out of my head, so I broke down and told my wife over dinner one night. She just listened and said it was probably my imagination. I later told my brother, who said something similar along the same lines. I never told anyone else, and I never hunted in those same woods again. I never even went back for the tree stand. It was like $300, and I didn't give a shit. I took a break from hunting for about 10 years and then started up again, but never in that area. I still wonder what I saw that day. I have no rational explanation. Later in 1988 or so, I saw that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Predator. I couldn't fucking believe it. I jumped up and yelled at my wife, "That's what I saw. That looks just like it." I don't know if the writer had a similar experience as mine, and that's what inspired him to make the Predator cloak the way it did, or maybe was inspired by some other eyewitness account. But the fact is, it's exactly what I saw in the woods in northern Georgia in the fall of 1978. Now mind you, not the reptilian-looking creature with lasers and shit, but the cloaking part. What I experienced has stayed with me all these years. The world is full of strange things. Really strange things. And some of them are out there in the woods. The past few weeks I've been awakened by something strange. No, strange isn't the right word. It's something monstrous and hideous. It's a dark and terrible thing that stands at the foot of my bed staring at me. Sometimes it has a menacing, grim expression on its face. Even worse, sometimes it stands there looking at me with a sinister, horrifying grin. Sometimes I can hear it making weird noises, hisses, mumbles, and an icy cold laugh. A laugh saturated with absolute evil. Now, let me tell you what this damn thing looks like. It's about 2 feet tall, with pointed ears and glowing red menacing eyes. Its mouth is kind of elongated with big sharp teeth all the way around it. And it seems vaguely reptilian. At least that's how it seems to me. It just stands there at the foot of my bed, or sometimes in the corner of the room, and stares at me. The other thing, too, is that it seems to appear just after 3 a.m. This disturbed me so much that I started doing some reading, some research into what this thing might be. And what I found out didn't make me feel any better. I did, however, discover a special prayer that should be recited to keep such things away. A few nights later, when I woke up and saw the entity standing there, I immediately started to recite the prayer. The thing instantly began seething and had an expression of the deepest, darkest contempt that you could imagine. I don't know if there are any words to describe it, but in just a few seconds it began to slowly fade away until it was gone. As it evaporated, it let out a terrible laugh and was gone. I see it every now and again, and when I do, the prayer chases it off. I'm looking to find a way to banish this thing permanently. Until I do, this battle will go on. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. The ocean can get pretty scary sometimes, especially for me being a deep sea diver. I go in with a few other people and just have fun. Sometimes we run into dolphins, sometimes seals, and the occasional shark. They're not bad though. The media portrays sharks in quite the wrong way. They're pretty peaceful for the most part. Well, most of them. But sharks are not what this story's about. This is about something worse. Something far, far worse. Some other people and I went out for a dive. Nothing too interesting. Just a regular dive. Going down into a cave. I've been through it several times on solo dives, enough to where I know my way around. We just looked around for a while, going deeper and deeper into the cave, being sure to pressurize ourselves whenever we needed to. We spent a little while looking at some small schools of fish and some coral, but nothing incredible happened. Some of the more notable things we saw before the real shit hit the fan were a sea turtle and a nurse shark. We went down a bit more and came into an area I hadn't really checked out, but since it was a recreational dive, we decided to check it out anyway. It was a medium-sized area of the cave where there wasn't water. It was like if you swam up and just popped your head out of the water, just air. And very cool air at that. I took out a waterproof radio I keep with me during dives, just in case, and turned it to the local news station. Sharks spotted next to the shore near the beachfront, possibly a great white. Stay out of the water and be safe out there, the lady said before looping the message. Well, fuck, I said after I'd looped a second time. What are we going to do now? One of my friends, Darren, said to me, I guess we'll just have to stay here. It shouldn't last for too long, probably only an hour or so. We can stay longer just to be safe. And that's what we did. So after a while, we ended up getting sick of this little prison, even though we could have left at any time. We put our gear back on and hopped back into the water. We swam up towards where we came in when we saw something. I looked closer at it, and it was something moving slowly from the other side of the hall we were in. I don't know if hall is the correct term or not, but that really isn't important. We were coming out of a cave. Joel, another one of my friends that went with us, screamed. As loud as you can scream underwater, though. The noise was muffled, but it sure as hell was audible. It was that fucking great white. It was right there. I felt like my heart stopped seeing it there. I've never come across one in person, not like that before. It didn't notice him or us, though. Its front side continuing to move forward across the exit of the hall. Now, what happened next didn't make anyone scream, not even a whimper. We just stayed silent, horribly silent. Coming out from the left side of the exit was the great white, but not the whole great white. Only about half of it. Something had fucking bitten the other half off. What in the hell can do that? So you better damn believe we made our way out of that area. The blood would probably draw in a few more sharks, and we didn't want to be around when that happened. Needless to say, we hauled ass out of there. We were coming out of the cave when we found the other half of the shark. It had been about 30 minutes since we saw the other half. Where were all the other sharks? There weren't any. Come to think of it, there weren't any other fish either. Where in the hell did the fish go? I knew something was wrong, horribly wrong. Fish never just disappeared like that. It's just not something they do. We came out of the entrance to the cave and started to head up when I felt something. Not really something physical, more like a sense, I guess, but I sure as hell felt it. Something was below us. And not something small, something big, something fucking huge. I looked down and saw a shadow. It wasn't moving, just stationary, completely still. It wasn't a shark. Sharks can't stay still because they'll drown. After a few seconds, everyone else looked down too and saw what I saw. We were in shock. What the fuck was it? It started heading for us. I could see the light reflecting off its eye. I still don't know what the eye belonged to. It was unnatural. Something I don't ever want to look into again. We headed back to that damn cave. What else could we have done? We made it in and turned around to see James swimming up towards the surface. We all screamed at him to come back, but it fell upon deaf ears. He kept going. Since nobody was doing anything, I started to make my way towards the exit. I got out and headed for James. I eventually reached him and grabbed his ankle, and he screamed. I pulled him down with me, and as I was doing so, I looked down to see nothing. And not like I can't see anything, just nothing there. James and I made it back to the cave safely and took a break for a second. About 3 minutes passed and we thought about just heading for the boat, but something stopped that idea from escalating any further. The back half of the shark was gone and the fish weren't coming back, so we just decided to stay put. We were about to head back to the little open area we found when I felt something in the water. Like if you move your hand next to your face underwater, you feel the motion. I looked toward where it came from and there it was. That fucking eye in the mouth of the cave. It took up about half of the 18-foot wide entrance. We hauled ass to the open area. About 30 minutes later, we heard something come up from the water. It was the shark's front half. How the fuck did that get over here? That thing must have wanted us to see it. It must have known we were scared and it was trying to heighten our fear. Hours passed and I was sure we were running out of oxygen in our tanks. We'd set them by the entrance to where we were. I turned around to see how full they were, but they were gone. They were just damn gone. Our equipment. We were fucked. We argued for a while, and Stefan eventually stopped our bickering though, mostly because he knew it wasn't going to get us anywhere, and he knew this thing was just fucking with our heads. So we cleared our minds as best we could and decided that we'd leave. We would just swim and hope for the best. You can trust me, I'm aware that isn't anywhere near to a solid plan, but we were nervous and out of our minds for the most part, and after all, we stood a better chance all going at once than us trying to go one at a time and dying one at a time over and over. We took a few extra minutes to prepare ourselves, physically and mentally. We did the hyperventilation trick and then we took the dive. As we swam towards where the exit was, we kept checking around us and behind us, but we didn't see anything. Eventually, we made it up to where we first saw the front half of the shark. We looked around before making our way out into the mouth of the cave, and we were running out of air, and fast. We needed to get out of here. We swam into the abyss. Looking up, you could see the surface, so we took off. We were almost there when that fucking feeling came back. That feeling where you know something's there, but you just can't see it. It's burning at the back of my head. I looked to my left to see James, to my right, Stefan, and in front of me, Darren. I turned to look at James, my eyes burning from the salt. I was feeling my consciousness start to slip away. Then I saw James disappear. Falling fast into the deep darkness of the unknown, he went. I couldn't do anything to stop it. I just kept swimming to the surface until it got closer and closer. I was almost fucking there. I thought I was going to die out there, but I made it. My head popped out of the ocean and I sucked in the biggest gulp of anything I'd ever taken and relished every goddamn second of breath I was able to experience. For a while, I just sat there stunned. James was fucking gone. Then Stefan and Darren popped up too. And we were all scared shitless. We took a second to regain control of ourselves and swam to the boat after we partially recovered. Stefan and Darren got up the ladder first, and as I was getting up, I felt something grab my ankle and I was yanked underwater by the thing that took James. It let me go. I climbed back up. It pulled me back down and thrashed me around. I climbed up yet again only to be pulled back under, this time deeper. I fought back and I tried to hit it, but I was released before it let me come into contact with itself. I swam to the top and climbed up the ladder. Stefan and Darren grabbed my arms and lifted me onto the boat. I sat there coughing for a while before looking back down. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was able to see how truly huge this thing was. It was almost double the size of our boat. But what I saw after that was nothing short of nightmarish. I saw James. The thing had his body with it. He was showing it off. My friend since middle school. It was waving his body around the water like a fucking child brags to his friends by waving his new toy in the air. This goddamn thing was taunting us. After a while of sitting on the deck of the boat, I actually looked at myself. My leg from below the knee was gone. There wasn't any blood though. It was cauterized. That's what scared me the most about it. I'm doing okay now though. I have a prosthetic. Still doing physical therapy too. It's a small price to pay to be able to walk again. We never figured out how our tanks disappeared like that. They were just gone. If you ask me to explain it, I won't be able to. I just know that 1 second they were there and the next they were gone. The Coast Guard found James's body floating out there in the ocean after they searched the cave for evidence. It was bloated and he had something on his back. From the pictures I got my cousin to get access to since he's a cop, they look like eggs. I don't know what they really are. But if they are eggs, what the fuck is going to hatch out of them? Blackwater Media presents Moonlight Terror, a horrifying collection of encounters with the monstrous creature known as Dogman. This collection features 10 never-before-heard accounts with this bizarre cryptid. These stories are not available on YouTube, Facebook, or any other social media venue. You can own this amazing collection in the MP3 format exclusively from Blackwater Media for the special price of $7.99. Order your copy today by going to blackwatermedia.net and experience the fear and malevolence of Moonlight Terror. A secret war is being waged all across the world. This war is being prosecuted by devoted warriors with a single objective: to rid the world of monsters. My name is Connor. I once shared with you the story of Apache Squad, the Special Operations and Containment Team, or SOCOT. In that particular situation, which took place in 2015, my squad engaged and eliminated a pack of Grey 220s, which I explained was the code name given for dogmen. Over the last 5 years, circumstances have required that our operation be expanded to global response capabilities. With the cooperation of other governments, we'd be able to commence containment operations anywhere in the world where our special skills were needed. Now, why was this done? Well, the answer is pretty simple. You see, over the last 5 years, sightings, encounters with strange creatures has steadily risen. This even includes attacks and, worse than that, deaths. That's right. These motherfuckers are no longer content to remain in the shadows and stay the subject of rumors and superstition. They're making themselves known, making themselves visible, and it's costing human lives. My first action outside of the U.S. took place in the Lake al-Assad region of Syria. According to the reports, the people of this region have lived in fear of creatures they believe came from out of the Badlands in search of victims. The creatures were said to be human-like, but much bigger, and would drink the blood of sheep and goats. And then people started coming up missing, especially children. We learned that even military forces operating in the region were also aware of these vampires and had seen them on many occasions. From that point on, the soldiers would never be alone after dark. Apache Squad intercepted 4 of the creatures skulking outside of a village. Although wildly aggressive and incredibly strong, we knew that these sons of bitches were vulnerable to and desperately afraid of fire. Now, back in 1978, the Defense Department discontinued the use of flamethrowers because, according to them, they weren't effective in modern combat situations. But that was bullshit, because for our purposes, they were just what the doctor ordered. Once the fire flew, the creatures let loose with their unholy screams and wails that flew out into the night air. What was left of them were smoldering heaps of filth, which were to be boxed and sent to the lab boys for analysis. 4 less monsters in the world. 4 fewer nightmares that haunt the darkness. But all of us realize that our work is far from over. There are more of those damn things out there. And things that were worse. Far worse. We remained in that area for another 2 weeks and were able to dispose of 22 bloodsuckers in all. Anyway, eventually we got back to the Damascus headquarters for debriefing and received our next assignment. It was only the beginning. There were units like Apache Squad deployed across the globe. Buenos Aires, Cairo, Lagos, everywhere, operating in defense of mankind, eradicating the monsters of old off the face of the earth. These were the opening gambits in the Nephilim Wars. The old storage sheds along the tracks were abandoned shortly after the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was built, and it wasn't long before the poor folk of the area moved in. You see, the sheds provided shelter of a sort, although the winter wind still pierced through every crevice, and the small fireplaces that the poor constructed did little to keep the cold at bay. A gentle, kindly woman named Jenny lived alone in one of the smaller sheds. She'd fallen on hard times, and with no family to protect her, she was forced to find work where she could and take whatever shelter was available to someone with little money. Jenny never had enough to eat, and in winter her tiny fire barely kept her alive during the cold months. Still, she kept her spirits up and tried to help other folks when they took sick or needed food, sometimes going without herself so that another could eat. One cold evening in late autumn, Jenny sat shivering over a fire, drinking broth out of a wooden bowl, when a spark flew from the fire and lit her skirt on fire. Intent on filling her stomach, Jenny did not notice her flaming clothes until the fire had burnt through the heavy wool of her skirt and began to scorch her skin. Leaping up in terror, Jenny threw her broth over the licking flames, but the fluid did nothing to douse the fire. In terror, Jenny fled from the shack and ran along the track, screaming for help as the flames engulfed her body. The station was not far away, and instinctively Jenny made for it, hoping to find someone to aid her. Within moments her body was a glowing inferno, and Jenny was overwhelmed by pain. Her screams grew more horrible as her steps slowed. She staggered blindly onto the tracks just west of the station, a ball of fire that barely looked human. In her agony, she did not see the glowing headlight of the train rounding the curve, or hear the screech of the brakes as the engineer spotted her fire-eaten figure and tried to stop. A moment later, her terrible screams broke off as the train mowed her down. Alerted by the whistle, the crew from the station came running as the engineer halted the train and ran back down the tracks toward poor dead Jenny, who was still burning. The men doused the fire and carried her body back to the station. she was given a pauper's funeral and buried in an unmarked grave in a local churchyard. Within a few days, another poverty-stricken family had moved into her shack, and Jenny was forgotten. Forgotten, that is, until a month later when a train rounding the bend west of the station was confronted by a screaming ball of fire. Too late to stop, the engineer plowed over the glowing figure before he could bring the train to a screeching halt. Leaping from the engine, he ran back down the tracks to search for a mangled, burning body, but there was nothing there. Shaken, he brought his train into the station and reported the incident to the station master. After hearing his tale, the station master remembered the poor dead Jenny and realized that her ghost had returned to haunt the tracks where she had died. To this day, the phantom of Screaming Jenny still appears on the tracks on the anniversary of the day she died. Many an engineer has rounded the curve just west of the station and found himself face to face with the burning ghost of Screaming Jenny, as once more she makes her deadly run towards the Harper's Ferry station, seeking in vain for someone to save her. A few years back, a mother and father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They decided to call their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, their two children were already fast asleep in bed, so the babysitter decided to check in on the children and then do a little reading. Later that night, the babysitter, after reading several chapters, put her book down and thought about watching some TV. Now, she knew that the television in the den did not have cable, but the TV in the parents' bedroom did. So she went upstairs and gave them a quick call to ask if it was okay for her to watch television in their bedroom. Naturally, the parents granted her request, but before they hung up the phone, the babysitter made one additional request. She asked if she could cover up the angel statue because, for whatever reason, it made her nervous. The phone line went silent for a moment, and the father, who was talking to the babysitter at the time, said, "Take the children and get out of the house. For God's sakes, get out of there now." Shocked and confused, the babysitter cried out that she didn't understand. The father, in a panic rage, replied, "Go! Go now! We don't own a fucking angel statue." Later on, the police found both of the children and the babysitter slumped down in pools of their own blood within a few minutes of the phone call. No angel statue was ever found. Back in the summer of 2014, I was living in Oregon. Nina, my wife's friend, and her husband Joe owned a nice-sized boat that he had docked in one of the coastal towns. Having lived there a couple of years while only going to the coast twice the entire time, when we were offered a ride on it one summer day, we agreed. I'd never really been on a boat, and I've always wanted to see what it was like to sail on the sea. I used to live in the deserts of Arizona, so living close to the sea was a real treat for me. Add to that the lush green of the state and the many forests it has, and I was awestruck. I never used to see much green in Arizona. Granted, it rained all the damn time, and it did get pretty cold. After all, where I lived, I was only a few miles from the halfway point between the Arctic and the equator, but it was a small price to me to live in such beauty. Plus, the no sales tax the state had didn't hurt its case either. So on the day of the trip, I was excited. We lived maybe 3 hours from where they lived, so we headed out early. It was 10 in the morning when we arrived. The summer air was in full swing and the ocean was breathing salty. It wasn't as hot as one might expect in the summer, but it was still pretty warm. We went over to their oceanside property and spent the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon hitting the shops and eating at one of the seafood restaurants. We then went back to their place to chill out for a bit before we headed out to the dock. By then it was almost 5 in the afternoon and the dock was part empty, probably because a lot of people had the same idea we had. When I first laid eyes on the SS Seafarer, I was stunned. Now to me, this was a majestic beast. To Joe, it was like part of his way of life. He'd had it for a year and loved its roomy deck and single engine prowess. I was in awe though. I was excited to get out on it. He gave me a tour of the boat before we set sail out onto the Pacific. We sailed out far enough that we lost sight of land. He knew the sea well and knew where the international waters were. After a bit of sailing, part of the time of which he let me take the helm, we stopped and looked out into the empty vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Joe whipped out a cooler with drinks and we sat on the deck and talked for hours. The change in temperature was noticeable when the sun set just after 9 p.m. We'd brought coats and sweaters as we knew it would get a bit chilly. The moon was out, but not very bright. We stayed another hour talking and not thinking about the problems in the world or in our lives for the moment. I was the one who first heard the sound emanating from the water. It was like a soft howl, but low enough that the others didn't seem to notice it. I heard it though, and began wondering what it could be. I was excited at the thought that it could be a whale. After a while it did it again, only slightly louder. This time the others heard it as well. My wife looked around and asked what that was. Nina said that she didn't know, and Joe began to actively listen as I was. After a few minutes the sound was heard again. This time instead of a howl, it was more like a growl. I started to suspect that it wasn't a whale and asked Joe if he'd heard anything like that before. He said no. Anyway, it got quiet again for a few minutes. My wife and Nina started to talk again when we heard a large splash which sounded way off but was loud enough for us to hear it. Joe said that if it was a whale, it was the biggest one he'd ever heard, and even at a distance it still wouldn't have been that loud. Then, the air suddenly turned foul and rancid. It was a horrible putrid smell like rotting fish and shit mixed in with salty air. My wife started to throw up while I held myself down the best I could. Then we heard the loudest growl I've ever heard. This was loud and it echoed through the air. Then we heard another loud splash. That's when Joe decided it was high time to get the hell out of there. As he raced to the helm to start the boat up, we heard the growl again, only this time it echoed from under the water. As he started the engine, the boat rocked suddenly back and forth as if a sudden wave had hit us. Once the engine started, he tried to pull forward. We moved, then suddenly stopped. Joe pulled forward again and then suddenly stopped. We weren't moving. He pulled forward again, this time increasing speed. We didn't move a fucking inch. I think it dawned on Joe and I at the same time that something was holding the boat. Joe let off the gas and stopped it altogether. We all realized in horror at the same time that the boat was starting to move on its own further out to sea. Joe immediately started moving forward again. He then reversed it and then pulled forward again. This time we felt a jerk. Something was indeed holding onto the boat. He reversed again and then pulled forward. This time it jerked, followed by what sounded like a screech coming from under the water. Joe did this again and again. The final time he broke free. As he sped off, we heard a splash, followed by the loudest screeching roar I've ever heard. This too echoed through the air. Well, we made it back to the dock, tired and exhausted, but most of all relieved to be on land. We drove back to their place where we stayed that night in the guest room. Next morning, we discussed what happened over breakfast. Joe and I agreed that it was some kind of sea monster. The girls weren't sure what it was, but didn't want to say it was a sea monster. Joe and I decided to head back to the dock that day. He wanted to inspect his boat. After noticing nothing around the boat, he decided to check under it. He put on a swimsuit and a breathing tank and jumped in. Now, he was under there for a few minutes before he surfaced. As I helped him up, I noticed the look on his face. He was shaken. No, he was scared shitless. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with frightened eyes. He said that whatever it was out there must have been big. When he checked the bottom, he noticed indentations on it, as if something had grabbed onto it hard, and it was on both sides of the boat and ran the length of it. Then he added that the propeller blade had what looked like bits of flesh around it, which meant that when we broke free, we must have cut the thing in the process. Somewhere out there in the dark depths of the ocean, there's a monster that's injured and angry. God help whoever encounters it next. In 2011, I was working at the Lewis McChord military base located south of Tacoma, Washington. I was employed at Public Works and assigned to the Environmental Department. I was part of a group conducting a study in the southern section of the base. There were several soldiers attached to the group for security. Now, we'd been out in the field all day and were getting ready to head back to the lab. About 5:30 p.m., we heard a distress call on the radio from one of the security attachments located north of our location. Then we heard gunshots coming from the same direction. The best I can describe the situation is that all hell broke loose. The civilians were hustled out of the area immediately. When we arrived at the lab, we were told by command that our department would be non-active until further notice. Next day, I received a phone call at home from a lady I worked with. Of course, she was wondering if I'd heard anything. I told her no one contacted me, but I was having dinner later with friends who worked on the base. She seemed very concerned because no one was answering calls at the base. That evening, I got together with friends who worked in other public works departments at the base. At that time, there was no official information available, but there were lots of rumors floating around. The most prevalent rumor was that one of the security detail went off his rocker and started shooting at other personnel. We were all called back to work about a week later. We each were given a written statement that, despite the rumors, the incident was a false alarm and that no one had discharged their firearm. We all rolled our eyes. This was pure, deep, creamy bullshit. Each of us had heard the gunshots and realized that the situation was more serious than what the military was stating. A month or so later, I was collecting samples in the field and was accompanied by 2 soldiers for security. We were back in the general area of the mysterious incident. One of the soldiers mentioned that all of the security people who were on duty that particular day were no longer with the division, which I thought was very odd. I asked if he'd heard anything about the incident. With a straight face, he said that something was shot after it scared a group of soldiers. I mentioned that I thought soldiers were not authorized to shoot at wildlife. Both the soldiers laughed and agreed with my comment. I asked, "What the hell's so funny?" They explained that they were never told what that something was, but there had been unconfirmed sightings of Sasquatch and other unknown man-like creatures in and around the base. Now, this information didn't really surprise me since I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and was well aware of the legend. That's all I can really tell you. I no longer work at Lewis McCord, but still have several friends who do. I will say that I'm more mindful of the cryptid world, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. I believe that the government and military are very familiar with these creatures. The sudden security boost during the incident, and then the fact that the biological and medical departments on the base were put on hiatus, leads me to believe that the military was in possession of one of these creatures. I have no confirmation of this, but my gut feeling indicates that that's exactly what happened.